Hi everyone. So today we would discuss something which is pretty important, and this is not only important to learn Python but for any programming languages. If you want to learn any programming languages, this concept would come in handy. So without any further ado, let's start off. So today we are gonna actually work or discuss on functions and how to define them in Python at least. So what is function really? So, if I speak mathematically, a function which is usually denoted by f, it is a mapping from one set to another. You know what set is? Set can be thought of as a just a series or a collection of elements, right? Unique elements. And say for example, if I have one set X which has multiple elements in it, it could be single as well as multiple elements, and then I have another set y where you again have some elements, some number of elements. Now the mapping, what does I mean by mapping? That some every for every element of x it can be mapped to one of the elements of y. That mapping is called function. This is mathematically. So mathematically we usually denote something like this, that f is termed as x map to y, and this needs to be holds true for all x, for all x belongs to x, right? So this is a mathematical concept, but without even mathematics, logically what does a function mean? It means that you are trying to construct something where you have something of an input. So this set you can think of is as some input. So you input something, and then you want an output based on the input. So the output needs to be dependent on input. So this set is also called output. So what is function? Function is the method how you are reaching from the input to output. So this particular mapping or the method how you converting these input elements into the output elements, that is basically the function. Just to give you some examples, let me start off with some very easy mathematical examples, and we can think of it then in terms of real life as well. So just a very simple mathematical example, you can think of a function as a squaring function. Let's say usually we denote a function by f of x, like function of x, and we denote it say by x square. Let's say f of x equals to x square. What does it mean? That for all x, what we want to do is, if you have one input x, you want to multiply x with itself, x into x, and that is how you found the x square, and that is your output. So you input x, this is so you input any number, and now what the input set you can think of, okay, whether I want to constrict myself to just integers or every number possible or anything. It's basically up to you how you are defining your function. But let's say x be only integers. If x is only integers, then this is the input that you are basically giving to the function, where you are inputting any integer, and then what is the expectation of the output? You basically want whatever is input, you want it to be multiplied by itself, and then that is what you want to output. So x is coming in, x square is coming out, and this is a function, right? So this is basically what function is. It could be a much more complicated, right? F of x can be x square plus 2x minus 3, right? It could be a quadratic equation where you basically input an x, which again can be anything you want. So the input set can be also anything you want, but the output would be dependent on the input. So this is always the case. So inputs, you can it's your choice how or exactly where you want to define that function, but once you define it, the output will always be dependent on the input set. So function is a pretty basic concept in maths, right? And it is not only a basic concept, but this is a way where anything can be worked. So in a real world example, let me give you a real world example where you would understand much more better. Say for example, you are trying to make a dish. You know all the ingredients that will basically make the dish. So, but just the ingredients itself doesn't actually create the dish, right? Doesn't create the food. You have to actually cook all the ingredients properly in an orderly fashion. Function is almost analogous to this cooking method, right? Because you can think of all the input parameters. So this is also something known as the parameter. So whatever you are basically inputting inside a function, you could say is as parameter or arguments. Parameter or these are also known as arguments. So anything that you are basically trying to basically put as an input, now every ingredient can be thought of as that, but just the ingredient itself won't actually help you to get the recipe or the finished product. For that, you basically have some very detailed steps and in an orderly fashion. Like in the first example, what we thought, like, okay, the step would be multiply the input number with itself, or it could be again multiply it with itself, then add uh, multiply 2 with that number and add that, and then probably subtract 3. So this was the whole orderly fashioned cooking method, right? So every similar to how in cooking you basically have a proper method, and if you change the method the taste changes. Similarly in function, if you basically change the procedure how you are converting input to output, obviously the output would also change. So now why this function is so necessary? So we understood what a function is from a very high overview, and we also saw a few examples, very simple examples, both mathematically and some real world example as well. And to just get a overview, you can think of other things as well. Like say for example, in a manufacturing plant, you can have something which is being converted into something else. So you have one input which is, say for example, you have one input, it could be anything, it could be some clothes, some metal sheets or anything. It is going inside probably some robot or something, and then you are getting a finished product out of it, output. In all these scenarios you can think of the method of how you are converting the input to output as the function which defines it, right? Now why functions are important from a data science? So at the end of the day, my goal is not only just discuss Python programming with you but also data science, right? And for data science perspective, if you want to know about ML, machine learning, so we have a very hard or very strict assumption on machine learning. That is, whenever we are actually trying to learn something, we are basically trying to understand or trying to calculate the function, because usually you have some input and some output of an event. So you know, okay, what was the input of that event, and usually you also, if it is a historical event, you also have the output of that particular event. Now you are trying to find out, okay, how exactly the input can be mapped to the output. That is, as I said to you, you are trying to find out the function. And what's the strict assumption? The assumption is for any task or any learning, you have one function which can map the input to output. You have to assume that there has to be one function which can map the input to output. That's after that only you would try to find out that function, find out that particular function. And once you find out the particular function, that's how you learn. So if you know the function, then you can simply give inputs, provide inputs to the function, and you would also get the output. So whatever input you would basically provide to the function, it would give you any output respectively, and that's how you get predictions, right, for future events or any event basically. So this is one of the major reason why functions are very important, but this is not the only point for importance of the function, but there are so many, because in any programming, so whatever you are trying to achieve through programming, usually we need one or other kind of functions, right? And so we have just started out on our Python programming journey, but even just up to this point we have used a lot of functions. If you have realized it or not, we have already used a lot of functions. You might remember about one function that we used called type. So in just the last video we were talking about data types, and to find out for any variable, so if you are storing some data in some variable, or even if we don't store it in a variable, if we just want to find out the data type, there is a function, built-in function in Python called type, right? So we usually type out type, and then inside the parenthesis we actually input or provide the data, and then what we basically find out, the type is the output. So whether it's a string or whether it's an integer, whether it's a list, so the data type is the output there, and the data itself was the input. So whatever you are providing inside of the parenthesis, that was the input, and the data type was the output there. So we have already started using functions, and the more we progress in our journey, we would use functions in a lot of other ways, and it would be very integral. So like at every step of the way, at every discussion point, we would use functions at one way or the other. So this is the reason why we need to understand how functions work, or how to call a function, how to define a function. Okay, so you get some theoretical idea about what functions are. Let's move on to the practical part then. Let's see how we can actually define a function, how to start working with function. Obviously, we would just see the basics of it today, but probably later on we can go on and explore more. So you know the drill. Let's start with opening the command prompt. Here it is. Then we can actually move on to the specific folder where usually you keep all your codes or everything. So I have a folder called demo. So let's change my folder to demo, change directory demo. Now in demo, let's see if I have any files already present or not. We already have demo.py, right? We have already written some scripts. Now what we would gonna do, instead of actually doing everything in Python interpreter as we have done in the previous day, we would today use the Visual Studio Code editor. So you know again how to open Visual Studio Code from command prompt. So you can just write code and just put a dot, which basically represents that you want to open Visual Studio Code in this folder, this location only. And if I press enter, we would open the Visual Studio Code. Okay, it automatically opened the demo.py, which we were working with in the last video. So let's actually remove this, or you can create some new files as well. You know, like this in this icon. If you just press in this icon, it will basically help you to create a new file. But since it was not very important, I can just delete it and start off with actually defining some function. Okay, so now we will basically define a function. How to do that? So what is the syntax? So how do you basically write or tell Python that you are trying to define some function? You start with a keyword called def. So whenever you start with this keyword def, def, Python understands that okay, you are starting to define a function of your own. So obviously Python and this we have already discussed. So Python already have some built-in functions. So Python have some functionality that you can basically implement through its built-in functions. And later on we would also install and use a lot of other functionalities through other libraries or packages, and we would actually see it in a later video how to install a package, how to work with a package. But just so you know, so Python already has some built-in functions like type that you have seen. You also remember about quit, right? Quit function or exit, which I have shown you in one of the previous videos of how you basically get out of the Python interpreter, right? So those are also functions. Those are built-in functions of Python, which is already like defined. But now you may want to actually define your own function because you have some functionality in your mind and you want to define it on your own. So how to do it? As I said, let's start off with actually writing def, and then you actually give the name of the function. So let's you can call it anything. Obviously there are some rules on how you name something, but usually you can actually you can have alphanumeric letters, or you can't actually use special characters, but usually you can use alphanumeric characters to actually define a function. And but you can't actually start off with a number. Just so you remember, you can't start off with a number when you are defining a function. Anyway, let's start with defining a function, and as I said, after the def keyword you need to provide the name of the function. So usually you can name it any way you want, right? But at the same time you also want to keep it something so that you understand later on what you try to do with this particular function. But right now let's just name it my function, and then you would provide a parenthesis. Okay, so because you have seen how a function is written, right? Usually you have a function and you have parentheses. Inside the parentheses you basically provide the inputs. So similar to that notion, you also put whatever inputs should be going inside this function, inside this parenthesis. So you can write say for example an input A, anything, and this input can be of any data type. It could be integer, it could be string, it could be a list. So we have studied about the different data types in the previous videos, right? So the input parameter or the input argument can be anything, and you usually put that inside it. Now there might be another question coming to your mind. Can a function have no input? It can. Obviously it can. But usually why you provide some input? If your function is dependent on some input, you basically need to provide an input. If it is not dependent, let's say like when I was doing quit. So if you remember, let's actually also open Python interpreter over here. So this was my command prompt. Just by typing Python, it would open my Python interpreter. Anyway, so here if I say just write quit, I actually can quit the Python interpreter, right? So this is a function, and this is how you call a function basically. So this is the name of the function, quit, and then under the parenthesis or inside the parenthesis there is no parameter given, no argument given. Why? Because quitting the interpreter doesn't depend on any parameter. So that's why if your function doesn't depend upon any of the input parameters or input arguments, then you can simply keep as it is, like keep the parenthesis blank. By that I mean like you can actually put nothing inside the parenthesis. But if and this is a big if your output of the function is dependent on some input, then you have to put that input inside this function parenthesis. Okay, now the next step is putting a colon. A colon is basically is used in Python whenever you have multi-line arguments. So some arguments can be ended in a single line, but in Python in function, in defining a function, it's a multi-line argument, and that's why you put colon. You would see in other places also where in Python you put colons, and then you need to return something. So as soon as I press enter, you have seen that the cursor has kept a few spaces, right? This is called indentation, and this is a way for Python to know if something is inside the block, right? And what do I mean by block? A function is a block in itself, right? It's the same thing. Even if you are writing it in different lines, it basically means the same thing. All you are trying to do is inside this function only. And to understand that, like, it's a single event that is happening. Even if it's a multiple event, it's all happening under the same function. To actually make it understand, you put indentation, or indentation basically means just put some spaces before you start writing the line. And how many spaces you want to keep, that is completely up to you. You can customize that in your editor, but you basically need to provide some indentation. You can't start the line from from exactly this position. Okay, so now you need to return something. Let's say we return just a print statement. Again, print itself is a function. So what do you want to print? You want to print hello from intelligent learner. So this is a string that you want to return. Obviously, if you see, for just to return this string, I do not need any input parameters. So this is the basis of defining any function. And since in this particular function, for just this particular function, we do not need any input argument or input parameter. That's why it's okay if we do not give it, right? So if I now save it, let's save this demo.py, and you can see that it's saved from the black dot disappearing. Now I can go to command prompt and run this Python file. So you remember how to run a file. You just see Python or Python 3, depend if you have like both Python 2 and Python 3 version, you have to mention Python 3. But since in my machine it's only Python 3 version, so I can just write Python and the name of the file, which is demo. It's demo.py, and if I press enter, nothing happened. Why? Why doesn't anything happen? Because up until this point we have only defined the function. Define a function means you have told Python that okay, this is how my function or whatever functionality you are trying to provide. But defining a function doesn't actually do anything unless and until you call that function. This is pretty important, guys. Always remember that just by defining the function, it doesn't actually, it defines the function and that's all. That's all it does. But unless and until you call that function, whatever functionality you are trying to provide through that function, it won't actually occur. Right? So how do you actually call a function? I have just shown you by in the quit function. So you just write my function and you can put the parenthesis like this. Now again, my function, what we have actually defined, it doesn't require any input, right? So we also don't need to give any input while we have actually calling this function. But if while defining the function, if we have actually provided some input, we also needed to provide that kind of an input in our function. Now let's save it and see whether it's working or not. So we have defined the function in line 1 and 2, and at line 4 we are calling the function, right? So let's go back to our command prompt. Let's clear the screen a little bit. So there's a command called cls in command prompt in Windows, through which you can clear the screen, as you can see. Okay, now let's write the same thing, python demo.py. So let's run the script, and now you see hello from intelligent learner. So whatever we were trying to print, it actually came up. So this is just the basics of how you can just define a function. You start off with this keyword def, you give a name of the function, you put parenthesis, and you return something. Always remember, if you are not returning something, you are not getting an output. So sometimes while we actually develop, so if you are actually into coding and if you are actually trying to program something, a lot of the time we just want to put some blank functions as well. So if you are actually trying to put some blank functions, there's a way to do it. That is, you just put pass. So you write a command called pass, and whenever you write pass, you Python interpreter basically understand that okay, there might be the case that it doesn't have anything to do with this function. So the Python interpreter understands this, okay, you have not written anything and there's nothing to implement in this particular function. So it won't actually output anything. But if you want to output anything, so obviously if you want your function to be functional, and the pun was intended, so if you want the function to be functional, you have to return something. Now let's actually up the ante a little bit. You want to return something which is a bit dynamic, because just printing a statement, it might not be that that clever, right? Or I won't say it might not be that interesting. So let's print a statement, but let's make it a bit dynamic. And what do I mean by dynamic? Let's say I want to print my name is and a dash, and then I want to add whatever my name is, which is a value. At least let's say it's a value. Now what is a? A is a value I want to input to the function. Why? Because I want that whenever I will call this function, I will basically input a name, and I want that this function will basically provide my name is this. Now you could see that I haven't put any special condition to a, right? What would happen if I say if I actually put something other than string? Because you see this is a string, right? My name is whatever I've written under the commas, this is a string. But what if this is not a string? So for that reason we could do two things. One thing is we can tell that okay, this is a string. So you could write that this is a string, or so by what did I do? So I basically kind of told the Python interpreter that whatever is coming, the parameter which is coming, it has to be a string. Or what I can do much more easily is put another function which basically creates a string out of a object, some other type of data. So just to showcase you how it works, let's actually let's go back to Python interpreter directly. And by the way, there's also another way, and let me show you guys that as well. One of the other reason why we use Visual Studio Code or such IDE is because it also provides you with a terminal, so you can work. So you don't have to go back to a command prompt or something or a terminal every time you want, but you can directly just have this terminal open. And as you have seen, so there's already a menu option called terminal, and I went to new terminal, and that's how I went to new terminal. There's also a hotkey which you can press to get to the terminal. And as you can see, it's a PowerShell, but if you want, you can basically create a command prompt, right? And I can actually delete the PowerShell because I don't want to work on the PowerShell. Now you see we are also in the ddemo folder, so I don't have to go back to the command prompt every time I want to run something. I can just directly write something over here, right? And now let's actually complete our code before we run this file. So now while we will be basically calling this function, let's actually put some string to it. Let's say okay, sorry, so before we go into that, let's actually show you how str function. So str is also a function. How does this work? So let us actually call Python over here, so that you now opened a Python. You just let me make this big for you. So we are into the Python programming shell, or the Python interpreter. Now say for example I define a variable. So in the last video we saw like defining different type of variables and also like different data types. Say for example I have a data type of integer which is like 9, let's say. So I define x as 9. So now this is a function, right? I just told you about the type is a function. So if I write type x, it should basically return what type of data x is, and it says the return says that okay, it's an integer, class is int. Okay, now what we can do is x equals to we can write str of say 9. What would happen? As I said, str is also a function, and what it does is it actually converts whatever data type you are inputting to a string value. So now, first of all, if I want to return x, you would see that there's a comma, there's a quote under which 9 actually comes. It's just not 9 which is coming. And also, if I put type of x now, then it would tell me it's a string, not an integer, right? So str basically converts everything to a string, every data type to a string. Now let's see. So now if we during calling the function, if we put something, some other data type, it will be converted to string, and it should return that my name is this, right? So what would happen, say for example, if we actually give some string? So let's say I write something like intelligent. Okay, if I return, let's save it, and if I just output this python demo.py, it will tell me, it will return my name is intelligent. But now intelligent is a string, right? And one of the functionalities of the function would be that it is dynamic, right? Now if I just say my function and inside the parameter I said Python and just save it. Now if I run the same function, same code, it will tell me my name is Python. So this is a dynamic, right? So whatever I am writing, my name will be like a constant, because during the print statement I have put it as constant. But whatever I am inputting, it would be converted to string and then added to it, right? Now why I need to use str? So up until this point, the both example that I have shown you, I was actually inputting a string. But let's say instead of string, if I actually do something else, like let's say 9, some number, right? It's just an integer. It shouldn't be actually possible to use an integer and just add that up with a string, right? So if I just do this now if I run it, what would happen? It would come my name is 9. Why it come like that? Because I am actually converting it to the string. But let's say I forgot to do that. I just am adding just the value a, right? If I do it like that and save it, now when I actually would call it, it would actually give me an error. Why? Because it won't be able to add a string and a number. And as you see now, it is not able to do that. And this error also tell you that can only concatenate string, not integer to string. So the error message itself tell you what's the problem with your function defining, right? So that's why we actually put str, which is a function again which can convert any data type to string, and we can actually save it again. And now if we just run this file, it is coming my name is 9. So you understand the basics of functions. So we would finish it off for today at least. Obviously function is a much more vast topic, which is very interesting, and which would be, as I said earlier as well, which would be needed and used every day in our programming life, every day. So from now on we would probably be using functions for everything, and you would see like how it actually makes your code easier, as well as you have to write less, right? Because every time if I have to print something, I would have to write my name is, and then whatever name I wanted to print, and this needed to be like called each and every time. But now, since I have basically put it inside a function, now I can just call that function with the parameter and it would return me something, right? So this is a way to basically reduce whatever functionality you want to provide. The more complex the function it is, the more complex function it is, the more actually the more time you are basically saving, and you can do a lot of. So what we did today is very basic in terms of the functionality, but we would progress obviously, and then you would see like how much things can be doable by using functions. So hope you guys learned something new today, and even if it is not new, you at least learned something, or you have some revision things that you have probably already knew. In the next video, we would again do something very interesting, very important in terms of learning the language. So see you guys. Until next time, keep learning.
Do like this video if you actually like the content, and don't forget to subscribe, and also share it with your friends or families who might be benefited from these videos. Thank you.